8 years ago, a Canadian Prime Minister visiting Beijing was routine diplomacy. Today, it is strategic defiance. What changed wasn't China's importance to Canada. What changed was that Trump spent 2 years treating Canada like a subordinate territory, threatening annexation, imposing arbitrary tariffs, and publicly humiliating Canadian sovereignty. And on January 13th, 2026, Mark Carney walked into the Great Hall of the People in Beijing to a red carpet reception, personal greeting from Xi Jinping, and state-level diplomatic ceremony reserved for America's most important rivals. While Carney was being honored in China's capital, Trump was telling reporters that the United States doesn't need Canadian products and that CUSMA, the trade agreement connecting 500 million people and $1.6 trillion in annual commerce, is totally irrelevant. Those statements weren't confidence. They were panic disguised as dismissal, the kind of thing leaders say when they realize leverage has shifted and they have no effective response. Tonight, we're showing you how Carney's Beijing visit represents the most significant realignment of Canadian foreign policy in a generation, how Trump's belittlement of Canada pushed Ottawa into China's arms with offers Trump can't match, and how what looks like a diplomatic courtesy call is actually the formalization of Canada's economic decoupling from automatic American primacy. Here's what nobody's discussing. Carney's China trip wasn't improvised in response to Trump's latest insult. It was the public reveal of 18 months of preparation. The groundwork started in October 2025 when Carney met Xi Jinping at the APEC summit in Seoul. That 12-minute conversation wasn't small talk. It was Xi personally inviting Carney to Beijing and Carney accepting, signaling that Canada was ready to rebuild a relationship frozen since 2018. But the economic preparation went deeper. In 2024, two-way merchandise trade between Canada and China hit $118.7 billion. Canadian exports to China, $29.9 billion. That's substantial, but concentrated in commodities, energy, minerals, agriculture. What China offered in Beijing was something fundamentally different: manufactured goods partnerships, electric vehicle manufacturing plants on Canadian soil, complete supply chains from battery production to final assembly, Chinese investment in Canadian automotive infrastructure that would create tens of thousands of jobs in Ontario, Quebec, and beyond. This isn't about buying more Canadian canola. This is about making Canada a manufacturing hub for the world's largest EV market. The numbers tell the strategic story. Canada currently sends approximately 70% of its exports to the United States. Less than 5% go to China. But 70% dependence on one market means 70% vulnerability to one government's whims. When Trump threatened 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports, that threat carried weight because Canadian exporters had nowhere else to go at scale. China's offer changes that calculation entirely. If Chinese companies build EV plants in Canada, producing 500,000 vehicles annually for North American and Asian markets, that's $15–20 billion in annual economic activity that doesn't depend on American buyers, American supply chains, or American approval. Historically, Canada avoided this kind of strategic diversification because the U.S. relationship seemed stable enough that alternatives weren't worth the political cost. Trump destroyed that assumption by making instability the defining feature of the relationship. Why did Trump react to Carney's Beijing visit by declaring Canada irrelevant? The obvious answer: Trump was insulted that Canada pursued alternatives to American partnership, but the real timing reveals deeper anxiety. January 13th, 2026, Carney lands in Beijing to red carpet ceremony. Same day, Trump tells media that CUSMA negotiations are going nowhere and that America doesn't need Canadian products. Notice what wasn't said. Trump didn't say America would impose tariffs if Canada didn't comply. He said America doesn't need Canada at all. That's not negotiating from strength. That's preemptive dismissal of a partner you're losing control over. He didn't threaten consequences for China engagement. He claimed the entire trade framework connecting North American economies is irrelevant. You don't declare a $1.6 trillion trade relationship irrelevant unless you're panicking about losing leverage within it. He didn't offer competitive terms to keep Canada aligned. He attacked Canada's value while Canada was literally signing alternative partnerships. The sequence reveals Trump's strategic impotence. When Canada announced the Beijing trip on January 6th, Trump had 1 week to offer something competitive: better trade terms, infrastructure investment, partnership proposals that made staying aligned with Washington more attractive than diversifying to Beijing. He offered nothing, just insults. And when Carney arrived in China to state-level honors, Trump's only response was claiming he didn't care. Leaders who genuinely don't care don't feel compelled to announce how much they don't care. Trump's statements weren't indifference. They were recognition that he'd lost the ability to control Canada's strategic choices. While Trump was declaring CUSMA irrelevant, Carney was negotiating deals that make American market access optional rather than essential. The China partnership has multiple layers, each designed to reduce Canadian economic vulnerability to U.S. pressure. Manufacturing investment, Chinese EV companies exploring plants in Canada, BYD, Geely, and state-backed manufacturers looking at Ontario and Quebec sites, not just assembly, full supply chains including battery production, parts manufacturing, and R&D facilities. Timeline, announcements expected within 6 months, construction beginning 2027. Agricultural market access, China discussing removal of punitive tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood imposed in 2025. Total value of blocked exports, $2.6 billion annually. If tariffs lift, Saskatchewan farmers regain their second largest market. Manitoba pork producers recover losses. But the bigger shift is Canada demonstrating it can wait out Chinese trade pressure because alternatives exist. Critical minerals partnerships. Canada holds massive lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth reserves. China needs these for technology manufacturing, batteries, and industrial production. Unlike Australia, which China pressured successfully for years, Canada is offering partnership structures where Canadian companies maintain control while China gets reliable supply. That's not subordination. It's transactional relationship between equals. Financial infrastructure. Discussions about expanding RMB-CAD currency swap arrangements, making bilateral trade less dependent on U.S. dollar clearing. Not de-dollarization, but dollar-optional trade that reduces American financial system leverage over Canada-China commerce. Here's what this structure reveals. Carney isn't replacing American partnership with Chinese dependence. He's building redundancy where no single partner can dominate Canadian economic policy. If Trump imposes devastating tariffs, Canada has China as manufacturing investment source and export market. If China tries using trade for political leverage, Canada maintains American and European partnerships. Neither superpower gets veto power over Canadian decisions because both need what Canada offers. Chinese officials are choosing their language very deliberately when discussing the Carney visit. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning stated, China is willing to work with Canada to enhance mutual trust, expand cooperation, and bring China-Canada relations back to the right track. Notice the phrasing. Back to the right track implies the relationship derailed, but doesn't blame either side explicitly. That diplomatic neutrality gives both countries space to rebuild without either appearing to capitulate. Enhance mutual trust acknowledges trust was damaged, while expand cooperation signals both sides see economic value in reset. Xi Jinping, greeting Carney personally, China values its relationship with Canada and sees great potential for cooperation across multiple sectors. Translation. China recognizes Canada as strategically important independent actor, not as American satellite. That's what Carney wanted, recognition of sovereignty, not just market access. Carney's response in Beijing, Canada is committed to building partnerships that serve Canadian interests while respecting the sovereignty and interests of our partners. Notice what wasn't said. He didn't mention the United States. In a statement about Canadian foreign policy made in Beijing, the absence of any reference to Washington speaks volumes. This isn't about balancing U.S.-China competition. This is about Canada pursuing its own interests regardless of great power preferences. He didn't promise to limit partnerships with other countries. No reassurance that China relationship won't affect American ties. Just commitment to partnerships plural, signaling Canada maintains multiple relationships simultaneously. Trump's competing statement, we don't need their products. CUSMA is totally irrelevant. The gap between Carney's measured diplomatic language and Trump's dismissive attacks reveals fundamentally different understandings of power. Carney understands that middle powers maintain sovereignty by building relationships with multiple great powers. Trump believes American power means partners have no alternatives. One of those worldviews still functions in 2026. The other just collided with reality in Beijing. Germany faced similar pressure from the United States over Nord Stream 2 and China partnerships from 2018 and 2022. Washington demanded Germany abandon Russian gas and limit Chinese technology investment. Trump threatened sanctions. Biden continued pressure with diplomatic language. The assumption was that Germany, as NATO member and American ally, would eventually comply. Germany didn't. They diversified energy sources, maintained selective China partnerships, and navigated between American and Chinese economic spheres while preserving decision-making autonomy. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Germany ended Nord Stream not because America demanded it, but because German strategic interests changed. The lesson: economic pressure works on countries with no alternatives. It fails when targets have options and patience to wait out the pressure. Canada studied Germany's approach carefully. Carney's team explicitly referenced European strategic autonomy concepts in 2025 policy documents. The difference is Canada has advantages Germany lacked: geographic position between American and Asian markets, resource wealth both superpowers need, and federal system where provincial governments can pressure Ottawa for pragmatic trade policy. If Germany could maintain autonomy while surrounded by American military presence and dependent on American security guarantees, Canada can do the same from across an ocean with no security threats requiring American protection. This isn't about trade statistics. It's about whether middle powers can exercise sovereignty when great powers demand exclusive alignment. When the United States treats allied leaders with contempt, threatens annexation, and declares their country's products unnecessary, what message does that send? That American partnership means subordination, not cooperation? That allies exist to serve American interests without reciprocal respect? That sovereignty is conditional on Washington's approval? When China offers manufacturing investment, market access, and diplomatic respect without demanding Canada abandon other partnerships, what does that signal? That economic engagement doesn't require ideological submission. That middle powers can transact with superpowers as equals. That alternatives to American-centric trade exist and function. For 75 years, Canada-U.S. relations operated on unspoken assumptions. Canada would prioritize American market access above all alternatives. Canadian foreign policy would align with American strategic preferences. When conflicts emerged, Canada would compromise to preserve the relationship. Geographic proximity and shared values made dependence on American partnership natural and permanent. That model just collapsed, not because Canada stopped valuing the relationship, because Trump made the cost of exclusive American alignment higher than the cost of diversification. When maintaining American partnership requires accepting threats, insults, and economic coercion, the relationship stops being partnership and becomes domination. Canada's China engagement is insurance against American unreliability. If Washington offers competitive terms and respectful treatment, Canada will maintain close ties. If Washington demands submission, Canada now has alternatives. That's not anti-American foreign policy, it's risk management. The damage isn't reversible by changing presidents or softening rhetoric. Once Chinese companies build EV plants in Canada, those facilities operate for decades. Manufacturing partnerships create jobs, supply chains, and political constituencies that defend the relationship. Future Canadian governments inherit infrastructure and employment that make China trade important, regardless of who's in Washington. Once Canada proves it can wait out Chinese trade pressure without capitulating, Beijing learns that coercion doesn't work. Future disputes get resolved through negotiation between equals, not through one side imposing terms on the other. Once Canadian voters see their government successfully navigate between superpowers while maintaining sovereignty, expectations change. Politicians who propose returning to exclusive American dependence face question, why surrender leverage we just proved we have? Once other American allies, Australia, South Korea, European nations, watch Canada reduce U.S. dependence without catastrophic consequences, they recalculate their own dependencies. The precedent spreads. This creates three irreversible consequences. First, American leverage over Canadian policy decreases permanently. Trump can threaten tariffs, but Canada can credibly respond by expanding China partnerships and diversifying exports. Second, China gains proof that middle powers will engage despite American pressure, making future partnerships with other American allies easier to pursue. Third, The assumption that American allies automatically align with Washington collapses. Future U.S. administrations negotiate with allies as partners with options, not subordinates with no alternatives. Trump can rage all he wants, but he can't stop Canada-China partnerships without devastating American interests. Trump could impose punitive tariffs on all Canadian imports, but that would spike prices for American consumers dependent on Canadian energy, lumber, aluminum, and agricultural products. American businesses would pay the tariff costs, not Canadian exporters who'd redirect goods to other markets. Could try blocking Chinese investment in Canada through secondary sanctions. But that would prove American willingness to punish allies for economic sovereignty, pushing every ally toward reducing dollar dependence and U.S. financial system exposure. Could try forcing Canada to choose between American and Chinese partnerships, but Canada would choose diversification over dependence, and Trump would lose the ally he's trying to control. The leverage is gone. Trump's threats push Canada to build alternatives. Now those alternatives exist. Threats don't work anymore. Trump wanted Canada's complete alignment with American foreign policy. Instead, he got Canada receiving state-level honors in Beijing while he declared Canada irrelevant Chinese manufacturing investment in Canadian automotive industry, competing with Detroit Canadian diversification strategy that makes American market access optional, a precedent showing American allies they can reduce U.S. dependence successfully, not through military conflict, not through formal alliance shifts, through quiet relationship building that Trump ignored until it was too late to stop. Carney just proved that middle powers can exercise sovereignty by building partnerships great powers can't veto. The question now is which American ally moves next?